All right, welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, before we get started with everything this evening, we have a traditional way of beginning all of our meetings when she's here. So I'm going to throw it over to Joanne Hulbert, who has a poem for us.
All right.
Joanne?
I always like to do a little research before I check out all the poems and I look at what the theme is. I did due diligence by looking around 1924, 26, in around there in the newspapers to see if I could find a poem about McGraw or about Pennant Park. Now, I did find the advertisement for Pennant Park that was in the Sarasota newspapers, and that was poetic enough. I mean, that was absolutely fantastic. The whole advertisement is marvelous, but there was no poem attached to it. But what I did notice on it, though, was that I said, oh my God, the main street that is going to be in there is Mathewson Avenue. I want to put my, what was it, $2,000 down on a little spot right there on Mathewson Avenue. Okay, so the first poem, though, I am going to give you is about McGraw, unfortunately not about Pennant Park. But after that, I am going to give you a poem that I would rather put out tonight, and it sort of is slightly connected. So first of all, we'll talk about McGraw. And here's this poem is from 1907, When Muggsy Quits. When we wipe out his name, what will be left to tie us to the game? Shall we forget that we're the entire cheese when our proud leader blows to take his ease, probably down in Pennant Park? Shall we sit calmly down and gravely doubt that all the rest of earth is camping out when Muggsy quits? All right, now I'm not going to go into the 6 other verses because I want to move over to the poem that I would really like to give tonight. And it was inspired by Mathewson Avenue. All right. And I could just see it now. Yeah, Mathewson Avenue. Christy Mathewson died on October 7th, 1925. So put the times all together and all. But here's my favorite poem about Christy Mathewson. Many years ago, I kind of had a little bit of a baseball crush on this guy because it was such good stuff that was written about him. But here's my favorite poem. It's from 1916 by Ring Lardner, no less. My eyes are very misty as I pen these lines to Christy. Oh, my heart is full of heaviness today. May the flowers never wither, Mattie, on your grave in Cincinnati, which you've chosen for your final fade away. I almost have it memorized. so everyone's wondering, he died in Cincinnati? No, he didn't. But you have to use your poetic in baseball, your history and your the language and everything in order to figure out what Ring Lardner is saying here. So take it away, Dan.
Oh my gosh, Joanne, I love it when you have your poems.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you very much.
And this to Christy Mathewson.
And there's to Christy Mathewson. There you go. A couple of things for announcements before we get going tonight. Would you like to be signed up for each meeting automatically? You don't have to go through clicking the links and get to Zoom and sign up on your own. Send me an email at bruce@brucemclurenh.com and I will put you on the list. You will get access details for each meeting right around the day before it's scheduled to start. Nice and easy that way. Jeff Cohen's here. Hey, Jeff, tell us what's going on with the pod this week.
Thanks, Bruce. Yes, on Baseball and Barbecue, we have the current pitching coach for the Kansas City Royals, Brian Sweeney. He was born in New York, inducted into the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame last November, and he has a great story to tell. So please tune in, Baseball and BBQ, on all your podcast apps. Thanks, Bruce.
I want to get Ben Abel in here as well. Ben, you've got something for us too. Go.
I'm working on producing the talk I had a week ago with 2 gentlemen from the site called Batters Box. Battersbox.ca is the link to the website. It is their top 30 prospects for the Toronto Blue Jays organization heading into 2025. So I did a full half-hour live stream to my YouTube channel a week ago on my podcast. I've got the podcast portion ready, and I just have to share it. I will share it.
You will see that in the chat in just a moment. The name of his podcast is the Golden V Podcast. We are hooked up to it on YouTube.
And the
And
hot dog did make an appearance.
what's that? Oh, yes, and the hot dog made it makes. There you
Well,
go.
I had to. That was the perfect place for it. That's Napa Valley
Perfect.
Stadium where that hot dog is found.
That's a hot dog, man. Let me tell you. All right. All right. Sabre Day is coming up this Saturday, February 1st, and we have 3 big presentations for you that day in our celebration of baseball. At 9 a.m., we're going to start with Tim Virgilio, who has a charity called Signatures for Soldiers. It has to do with autographs and auctioning those autographs and donating all the money to military charities. You're going to definitely want to be there to hear his story. At 12 noon, we will have Vanessa Ivy Rose, who's going to give her presentation, Hall of Fame DNA, the legacy of baseball legend Turkey Stearns. That is scheduled to be a fantastic look into the life of Turkey Stearns, and you're not going to want to miss that one. Finally, at 7 p.m., Donna Halper will be here. She's going to be discussing pioneering women in baseball history. Another really great presentation for you. That's 3 big presentations, all on Sabre Day, February 1st. All of the links are in the chapter meeting booklet that comes out each Monday. And now on to our feature presentation. In the mid-1920s, America was in the midst of a Florida land boom. In 1925, New York Giants manager John McGraw was convinced by several promoters to put his name behind a massive land development venture near Sarasota, Florida. Dubbed Pennant Park, the development totally near 1,500 acres to be built out with high-end homes and a business district. McGraw became so enmeshed in the development that there were reports he was going to step down as manager and hand the reins over to Frankie Frisch. Tonight's presentation discusses how McGraw was double-teamed by his naivete and the collapse of the land boom. The story of Pennant Park is a fascinating piece of both baseball history and Americana. Dan Levitt is the author of several award-winning baseball books and numerous essays. He is the treasurer of the Society for American Baseball Research and has co-chaired SABR's Business of Baseball Committee. Dan is a recipient of SABR's Bob Davids Award and the Henry Chadwick Award. His book, Intentional Balk, Baseball's Thin Line Between Innovation and Cheating, co-authored with board president Mark Armour, was awarded the Seymour Medal in 2023. Dan Levitt, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
Great to be here. This is a lot of fun, so appreciate it.
It is all yours, my friend. Go get them.
All right, well, it's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. So I'm hopefully during Q&A, we'll have a little time and be able to talk a little bit individually. So Bruce, thanks for that introduction. Just as background, the Florida land boom and bust of the 1920s was really one of the epic events of America's cultural, economic, and demographic history. People were coming to Florida and spending their money like we've never seen. And that reminds me, I'm going to try and share my screen here because I do have a presentation that goes with this. Let me see if I can do this. Can people see that?
There it is.
All right. The only part is that I'd like to get this to where I'm looking at the camera. Because my screen is to a different side here. That's all right. I will, I'll just look back and forth. I will. So people were coming to Florida and they were spending their money. Just for a couple examples, the Florida East Coast Railroad, which we have some statistics on, in September of 1922, the total revenue for that railroad for people coming down to Florida was about $300,000. In September of 1925, which was the peak, the revenue was $1.5 million. So a 5-fold increase in just 3 years of people coming down to Florida. And they were spending their money. As just one example there, that you look at the bank debts at Tampa banks, and Tampa's, because we're on the West Coast for Pennant Park, it's sort of relevant. The amount of bank debt in Florida had gone up 4 times. So people were coming down to Florida, they were spending their money, and a lot of that was because they were interested in the Florida land speculation. Land prices skyrocketed, and there were a lot of get-rich-quick schemes proliferating all over the place. The bust when it came was equally tumultuous, dislocating the lives of many Americans. And John McGraw, who was, as we all know, manager of the New York Giants and one of baseball's and New York's biggest celebrities, suffered more than almost anyone. And this is that story. So we will jump right in here. So as I was saying, right after World War I, there was this massive Florida land boom. So first, after World War I, there was a brief recession in about 1920 or 1921. And after that, the economy boomed. It had grown dramatically during World War I as America supplied arms and food and credits to the Entente powers. And then the economy grew an average of 10% a year in 1922 and 1923. And there was a prosperity for a fairly large segment of Americans. And these Americans all wanted a get-rich-quick scheme. There was this idea that there was these wonderful investment opportunities out there if only they could figure out where they were. And Florida land seemed like the thing. First of all, obviously, you have this wonderful climate, and now you could actually get there. The transportation infrastructure had really come into being after the war, and it's some of it started before World War I. It had been coming during the war, and then after. There was the railroads. You could now get there fairly quickly, a day or two, probably 2 days on the railroad. You could drive there in just under a week, and people had cars, or a lot of people had cars. So this was another way to get there. And then you had the steamship lines. So you could actually get to Florida much easier than you could have 10 or 20 years ago. There was an enormous marketing campaign. The large Florida landowners, these corporations that had held this Florida land for many, many years, started marketing this to Northern and Midwesterners as an opportunity. The quasi-governmental agencies, chambers of commerce, were marketing all over the place. The local newspapers were touting the opportunities in their cities. So there was this incredible marketing campaign throughout the US saying, Florida land, that's where you need to be. And then there were just enough stories of previous successes to make people feel like they could get rich. Coral Gables, which was really the first of the big spots that people were trying to build out. That was obviously on the east coast of Florida, but this was like 1921, 1922, and they sold out a whole lot of lots to possible home buyers and or speculators, which was a big part of this, in just a day and a half. So you had these success stories, so people felt like there was really an opportunity to make money in Florida. Well, McGraw had always wanted to have a big hit and in money. He was all, back in 1907, which I think was the date of Joanne, your first poem. He was selling mining stocks in Florida. He had basically, after spring training, he went to did a spring training out in Los Angeles. He realized there was stocks you could sell in California, oil and mining stocks. And so he tried to do that in 1907 and 1908. It was a big failure. He tried to start an oil company in 1920, which was also a failure. He had these designs that he was going to get rich and he was going to make money the same way all the people that he worked with, whether it was Charles Stoneham or John Brush, or that the people that he worked for, he wanted to make this kind of money too. Well, McGraw knew Florida well. He often wintered in Cuba. He would go through Florida many times to winter in Cuba. So he knew Florida. And John Ringling of the Ringling Circus was a good buddy of his. Basically, everybody was a good buddy of McGraw's. McGraw knew everybody in New York. Ringling was a pal and convinced him to move spring training to Sarasota in 1924. So McGraw had been in Florida now for the spring of 24, spring of 25. And he was seeing all this activity, this frenzy around Florida real estate, and he was ready to jump in. A man named E. Phocion Howard, who, if he didn't exist, somebody would have invented him. Howard was sort of this larger than life guy who started out working in Washington when his dad was there as a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, saw all the massive corruption going on with the senators and congresspeople that he worked around, and started his own schemes around selling mining stocks and oil stocks that had probably very little chance of ever making any money. Well, by the time of the mid-20s, he was publishing a weekly sporting magazine called the New York Press, which was essentially a horse racing publication that also touted various stocks and stockbrokers. Westberg Pegler was a good buddy of his, and talked about how, talked about his sort of sartorial choices. He would wear purple shirts and a purple tie and white spats and a white hat and white shoes, and he would drive a Rolls Royce whether he could afford it or not at the time. And he was also famous for saying all horse players must die broke. So this was a guy who knew everybody in New York and had a lot of underworld connections. But in any case, Howard was a friend of McGraw's because, as many of you on this presentation know, McGraw loved horse racing. And so he and Howard were good buddies through horse racing. Howard introduced him to two Chicago real estate sharpies, Louis Polakow and Israel Perlman. And they knew of this piece of land on the west coast of Florida. They had actually been in the ownership title at one point, and they talked McGraw into, they told McGraw this was a great opportunity, and McGraw didn't need much convincing, quickly was excited. His initial investment was only $5,000. His partners were essentially New York gamblers and entertainment folks. Tim Mara, who was a broker gambler, a bookie gambler, who later bought the New York football, well, that year bought the New York Football Giants, was a big investor. Whitey Beck, who some of you might know. I mean, I saw Gary Mintz on here. You might know some of these, bookies from the 20s. They were all putting in about $20,000 each. So he was raising money from his gambling buddies and some of his entertainment buddies. And here's a picture of McGraw touring the site in a seaplane. McGraw was an early pioneer of flight. He liked flying, and you can only imagine how excited he was touring his site in a seaplane. So where exactly is this site? As you can see here, it's between Sarasota and Bradenton, just south of Tampa Bay. There's going to be two parts to how I describe this site, but on the very eastern part of that site now, for those of you who know the area, is the IMG Academy, the Mick Nolatieri tennis academy that he started, and now it's sort of for elite training for all sorts of sports. The west side of the site, where you're not on the water, but just generally that west side of it, is actually still undeveloped, which gives you some sense of how obscure this site must have been in 1925. And as we will find out, part of the reason why this didn't really work. So McGraw initially bought about 1,056 acres, the eastern part of the site. That's the Tamiami Trail to the west, or not to the east, or US 41, and on the north is Cortez Road, or 44th Avenue, again, for those of you who know the Bradenton, Sarasota area. And I couldn't believe these numbers until I actually went through the Manatee County records, which is Bradenton's county, and went through they actually still have all the sales documents there. So you can actually follow this if you can sort of figure out what's in these sales documents. And this is really amazing to me, right? So in August of 24, before this whole thing started, the site sold for $20,000 with about $3,500 down, which was fairly typical, 10 to 20%. By the time it got to McGraw's group, they were paying $792,000 for the site with $200,000 down. Just incredible amounts of money you can just see how much these things have been marked up and how hard it was going to make these deals work. So the other problem with the site, now let's go back a minute, it doesn't have much water frontage, right? If you're going to do a big water development, and part of McGraw's shtick was that they were going to have if you bought a lot, you were going to be part of a yacht club. All they have there is that little blue line at the bottom, which is about 1/3 of a mile water frontage along Sarasota Bay there, across from Longboat Key. Well, so what did they do? They had to buy another site. So they bought a site just to the east, which is that red triangle, which gave them about another 1.5 miles along the water. So now they had close to 2 miles along the water, which is what they needed. But now you can see they had close to, $1.7 million into this site. although again, on this one, they only had to put $50,000 down. So at this point, they had $250,000 into this site. And they were going to have to come up with another $1.4 million, over the next few years. Basically, the other $1.4 million was secured by a purchase money mortgage. So if you didn't pay the rest, the land seller could foreclose and take the site back. So this is a picture of the site. You can see it's completely raw. It's jungle and it's scrubland. There's nothing there. And the total between the two sites is about 1,500 acres. The first site was about 1,056. The second site was about 400. And without even getting into the costs, of individual roads and stuff, you're going to have to clear essentially this 1,500 acre site. So there was a grand design. You can see at the top there, as Joanne mentioned earlier, you have Matheson Boulevard across the top. Along the water there is Kennesaw Mountain Landis Boulevard. If you want to get in good with the commissioner, what better way than to name the road along the water for him? The other roads were all named for his players. It was a joke that you could tell if McGraw liked you or not by whether you had a road, named after you. And movie actors and then tycoons, sort of, Charles Schwab was going to have a road named after him. So, New York industrialists, Peyton Whitney, people that McGraw wanted to be like and probably knew a little bit. There was this ambitious business district, which was going to have circular roads and was going to be sort of like a Spanish or Spanish American city. It was going to be 80 acres, this really marvelous business district if it had ever come off. A yacht club, a golf course, ball fields. McGraw was planning to move spring training there for 1927. So it's all put in place. We have just this raw land and a bunch of maps with stuff drawn on it. And they start marketing it in November of 1925. And I think one of the most interesting things is that McGraw was clearly going to move south. He was building a $40,000 house on Sarasota Bay in Sarasota in the Golden Gate area of Sarasota. And for those who know that's that wonderful peninsula that sticks right out into Sarasota Bay at the sort of the end at the bottom of Longboat Key. And he was building a $40,000 mansion there with servants' quarters. He was going to move from Pelham in New York down to Sarasota. So what did this look like? Here's a little bit of a larger picture of the park, of the maps. And again, this is all they had. They had maps. There was nothing more than maps. There was no engineering drawings. And, so the lots were going to range from about $2,000 in the sort of away from the water to there was a few lots that were about $15,000, sort of the choice lots on the water. It was estimated that the lots were going to cost about $750 per lot to finish. And so that would have been, given 5,000 lots, about close to $4 million. Now, again, this is only the 5,000 is the estimate for the eastern part of just that original 1,056. When you include the other, there was probably 8,000 lots. And you can imagine the massive infrastructure costs. So roads like Matheson Boulevard was 100 feet wide. That was going to cost about $25,000 a mile. The smallest roads were about 20 feet wide. Those are going to cost about $8,000 a mile to build. So you're going to have to build roads. You're going to have to clear this. You're going to have to put in, sewer. If you're going to put in sewer lines, you're going to have to put in water. You were going to have to build roads. If you go back, remember, you're about a mile from Tamiami Trail and Cortez to the north. You're going to have to build roads out to that. You can just see how much money this was actually going to take. So, the hope was that you were going to sell lots so fast that was going to get you enough money to cover all of these costs. So salesmen were recruited throughout the United States. They were opening offices in pretty much every single, he had the realty company that he had hired to market this. They were hiring salesmen in pretty much every major city throughout the US. In New York, they were thinking maybe they were going to need more than 50 salesmen. And there were ball players. They brought in ball players to market this as well. Ivy Olson, the shortstop for Brooklyn, who had just retired, was marketing it in Brooklyn. Rosie Ryan was marketing it up in Boston. Dutch Ruther, who had just been on the Washington Senators championship team, was in Washington marketing it. So, he and his marketing team were recruiting ball players to do this, and they were hiring people to do this. Just for an example, I have the one ad here. This ad is from the St. Louis newspaper. And, you know, I mean, here you go. They're looking for 5 people in St. Louis to market Pennant Park. I mean, this was a massive campaign. So again, Joanne mentioned some ads. The one on the left here was in the Sarasota paper. This is November 30th, which is really, they really started marketing this in mid-November. So this is November 30th. And I'm just going to read a couple of things here because I just think these are interesting, and they're key points for this. Here in the top there says, here in Florida, I am personally going to live. When my ball teams are forgotten, Pennant Park will remain a thing of beauty where people will find happiness and pleasure. I frankly believe the public demand will exhaust the supply, and that early purchasers, those who do it now, which is in caps, will be the chief financial beneficiaries. If you want to join me because the price of home sites at Pennant Park will go skyrocketing like tickets for the World Series or the Army-Navy game, let us select a home site for you at Pennant Park. And here's sort of, I think, a key point from this one. As yet, I have neither literature, nor maps, nor plats, nor anything save Pennant Park and an unbounded faith in the future. You too must have faith in me and vision. So again, we got to sell these lots really, really fast because that's the only way we're going to get money to do all this work that actually has to get done. And then on January 17th, well, I'll take the middle one first, which I thought was kind of funny. This is one of the salespeople that's sending a letter to Gary Herman, who of course was one of the owners of the Reds and the head of the National Commission, president of the National Commission, saying, "Hey, Gary, it's time you need to buy a lot." And then in the handwriting there is, "How about a couple of lots? We have an avenue named after you." So what better way? Let's get Gary Herman to buy a few lots down on Gary Herman Boulevard. And then on January 17th, which is the second one, this is from Brooklyn, the second ad over here. They blitzed Sunday newspapers throughout the country on January 17th, 1926. There were ads pretty much in every major paper in the Midwest and in the Northeast. And again, some of these here are just fun to read, and some of them are going to be key for the rest of the story. I believe that Pennant Park is the greatest winning combination I have ever managed. And then I and my associates have all the money required to carry on the huge development program already underway. I do promise that every claim made for the property can be substantiated, and every promised investment will be an accomplished fact. And I don't want to foreshadow too much, but that is going to come back to be meaningful in this story. Okay, so as you can imagine, this brought a lot of notoriety to the area. I mean, McGraw was one of the most famous people in New York. People were talking about it there, and people were talking about it down in the Sarasota, Bradenton area and Tampa, and pretty much throughout the west coast of Florida. Along with John Ringling, who was doing his own developments in Sarasota and Tampa. They brought down Will Rogers, the famous humorist and columnist. And again, for those of you who follow the 1920s, which I'm guessing is a lot on this call, Rogers was one of the most famous people in America at the time. Ringling and McGraw underwrote his visit, the cost of his visit down to Florida. BC Forbes, the publisher of Forbes magazine, they had come down. McGraw had a promise from Jimmy Walker, the mayor of New York, that he was going to come down. They came down and touted McGraw and touted Sarasota and used this as a way to tout the area and then have other newspapers around the country pick it up so that just to build excitement. And as you can imagine, the Sarasota and Bradenton movers and shakers and newspapers were extremely excited about all this publicity coming to their towns. Well, sales soon dwindled. This is one example I found of one Tampa area brokerage house. So in October, they had $3 million in commissions. By February, that was down to 400,000. And over the first 3 weeks of March, it was down to 200,000. So the spigot was clearly being turned off. late in 1925. This middle one, the red, is what they'd sold. You can see that they hadn't sold nearly as much as they were going to need to. Again, they were actually selling a few sites, but just not enough to pay the huge costs that they had, or B, the boom throughout Florida was collapsing, and they weren't going to have enough. They weren't going to have enough money coming in from this. And then, as in February, with sort of this negative news coming in and apparently turning on them, McGraw switched realty companies, and you can see on the far right is their second ad, and it's a lot. From in hindsight, you can see the desperation in this ad. So I'm just going to read a couple of comments out of this. Buy 2 home sites in Pennant Park now, and later sell 1 to finance your building operations. And then nothing can stop the migration to Florida. Year by year, your profits will grow higher and higher. Start with the pioneer fortune makers. So we've kind of moved beyond, come on down here and buy a home lot, to, buy 2, buy 3, get rich quick. And so they're clearly trying to sell these quickly because they are running into trouble. And, by April, they were in deep trouble. The land boom was collapsing throughout Florida. Essentially, the end of 1925 and the beginning of 1926, it just sort of fell off the table. The way that, and part of this is that you had this just sort of crazy system. So if you remember seeing the prices for the overall park, people were selling smaller lots that way too, where you pay down, you put down a relatively small amount, and then the rest you pay over time. And the buyer that would get a document that was called a binder, and which was basically the purchase agreement that said, I just paid $100 and I'm going to owe you $10,000 over the next 3 years. Well, the people who did this, they didn't actually want to buy the site. They were flipping those binders. So you would then go sell the binder to someone else for $5,000, and that person would then owe the remainder. And then that person would try and flip it. So these people were flipping binders, or were flipping the contracts, if you will. And once there was no one to buy the binder, the music stopped, because nobody was actually going to pay the principal that was owed on the rest of the land. So that other 80 or 90%, no one who bought these sites was actually going to pay that, because none of these sites were really worth that kind of money. The first lawsuit came in May for $14,000. In August, McGraw started personally reimbursing people who had bought lots for 50% of their cost. I mean, McGraw was personally, he was personally humiliated by this. He had talked his friends into buying lots. Roger Bresnahan bought 2 lots. I mean, he had talked people that everybody he knew, he had talked into buying a lot. And now this thing had completely collapsed on him. At the time he did this for 50%, people were very thankful for him. And the press was saying John McGraw didn't have to do this. Other people weren't doing this when they set up McGraw Pennant Park Corporation. It was all, it was a corporation, so they had liability protection under the corporate shell. They then transferred it to a trustee for the actual development. So everybody involved in this was protected by the corporate shell, and people assumed that McGraw had this protection. So people were when he was reimbursing lot buyers, they were praising him for that. Well, the problem was, as it turned out, McGraw really did have personal liability, because he was liable under the mail fraud laws. All that stuff that I read you from those ads, none of that, of course, was ever substantiated or validated or came true. They clearly didn't have enough money to build it out. People weren't doubling their money. And so under the mail fraud laws, because obviously a lot of newspapers went through the mails, he was personally liable. So he essentially, over the next 5 years, was working with his attorneys to try and pay people off and negotiate the best settlements he could. Lawsuits followed. Pennant Park went through bankruptcy and foreclosure back to the people that he had bought it from. He lost his house, which he had just completed in Sarasota. They lost the house. And he later estimated the loss at about $100,000, which essentially was his life savings. And could have very well been more than that when you figure in all the money he had to pay back, plus what he would have had into his house. Well, so why the disaster? I mean, a lot of this we've hinted at as we've been talking about it. There was lots of reasons. First of all, you just had this Florida land bust, and it's hard to believe that he could have ever sold enough lots given the environment in Florida by late 1926. But, you know, even without the land bust, it would have been really difficult for him to succeed. He had this naive trust in his partners. So McGraw actually went down to Florida between Thanksgiving and the middle of February 12 times, essentially once a week. And you got to remember that to get to Florida at the time, you weren't just sort of flying down there. I mean, you were taking the train and, you know, getting on a car. I mean, getting to Tampa was not as easy as it is now. And so, you know, take a couple days to get down there, a couple days to get back. When he was down in Florida, he was like talking to city planners. He was talking to, you know, the people who were doing the work on the park. Essentially, they're doing about they're spending about $1,000 a week trying to fix the park, Pennant Park. And you can just see that given the cost we were talking about, you know, $30,000 over, you know, 4 or 5 months just was not going to be enough. So when he was down there, he was pushing the workers. He was working with the cities. But when he wasn't there, nobody was really doing anything. The sales agents, they were busy selling and making their commissions, but nobody else was doing anything. He paid far too much for the site, as we saw. I mean, to be able to make up that $1.4 million, they were just going to have to sell so many lots that, you know, it just made it too tough. And then they were drastically undercapitalized. You know, there was no one big investor that was just pouring money for them. It was a lot of, you know, it was bookmakers and gamblers and entertainment folks in New York that were putting, you know, $20,000 or $30,000 in to the Pennant Park Corporation. And that just wasn't going to be enough to be able to spend the kind of money that they needed. So, you know, it's clear that McGraw was never the same person again. He likely would have, you know, retired as manager when this was a big success, you know, when everyone thought it was going to be great around, you know, in January of 1926, when they had all this momentum before it went off the cliff. You know, Frankie Frisch was asked about becoming manager, and, you know, Frisch had been asked to go manage in the winter leagues. And when he said, you know, was asked about being manager, he basically said, I haven't heard about that yet. To me, the yet was the key thing. I think Frisch knew that he was going to be manager. McGraw was going to move. He was going to become the impresario of this, you know, wonderful place. He was going to be the big shot on the west coast of Florida. And that's what he was going to do with the rest of his life. You know, he had just won himself 4 straight pennants. And I think he was ready for the next challenge. And especially since he thought he was going to have a whole lot of money. You know, when it failed, he just became excessively bitter toward his veteran players. You know, late in 1926, as many of you know, Frankie Frisch jumped the team. McGraw was just a terror to Frisch in 1926, and he was just really a terror to a lot of other people on the team, a lot of his veteran players. I mean, he had the younger players coming up, but the veterans, he was just very abusive to. You know, he was humbled in the sense, plus, you know, you had opposing players would mock him, and, you know, somebody, you know, McGraw would be out there at third base or going to argue with an umpire, and, you know, somebody would yell at him, hey, McGraw, hey, well, Muggsy, they would call him when they were trying to be mean to him. You know, hey, Muggsy, can I buy a lot at Pennant Park? You know, I mean, this was just constant, and you can just imagine how the Imperial McGraw, you know, looked at this response. And then clearly something was going on with him, sort of how much will he had to try and run the business. You know, he no longer really exerted that full control over the Giants front office that he had in the past. Jim Tierney, who was the secretary at the time, started to get a little bit more influence around the team. You know, Stoneham was doing some stuff without McGraw's necessarily always talking to McGraw. So, I mean, McGraw was still the main guy. I mean, I don't want to minimize this too much, but his will and his interest in sort of running this team had clearly been sapped a little bit by this disaster. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I would just conclude by just giving Bill Coram, the sports writer who knew McGraw well and really became a sports writer in the 1920s, basically said, after 1926, McGraw was never the same. And I think that's very much the case. So thank you, Bruce, for having me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Wow, that is quite a story, Dan. I unfortunately missed this presentation in Minneapolis, so I've been really anxious to see you this evening. And I didn't anticipate that many twists and turns. So thank you for this. This is amazing. So now, if you want to get in line to talk to our presenter tonight, Dan Levitt, if you have a question or a comment, go down to the bottom of the screen and hit the react button. Once you hit that button, you're going to see another button marked raise hand. Raise your hand and we'll get you in line to talk to our presenter tonight, Dan Levitt. We've already got some people in line, and look who's first up. Karen Holleran, unmute. You're up, my friend.
Interested. You were talking about all of the people who went into this situation, like the planning, and you were talking about, are you talking about naive people who donated? Or are you talking about people who just backed out and got tired and didn't have any idea what they were doing?
So I would say two things. One is there were sort of two groups of people, right? There's the people that invested in Pennant Park, McGraw Pennant Park Corporation, which McGraw at the beginning to buy the site, and then theoretically to pay for all this marketing. They had about a $250,000 marketing budget, which was a huge number at the time, to market through all these newspapers. So that group, they were not naive people. They were bookmakers and entertainment folks in New York, but I think that they followed McGraw. I think McGraw got really excited about this. What I'm saying is that I think that they were naive to think that they could make money on the site that was this expensive. I think Polo and his partner, I think they, I don't know that they really understood or explained to McGraw where the site was. I mean, this was also a very obscure location, which I didn't really talk about as much, but you can see by where it is that this is not Coral Gables. This is not Miami Beach. This isn't Tampa. Davis, for those Tampa, Davis Island, right off of downtown Tampa, had in 1923, it sold out about $18 million worth of lots, right? I mean, that's a much better location, Davis Island, right off of downtown Tampa in Hillsborough Bay, than this site is. So the naivete is really on McGraw, and I guess I'd say on his investors' part, for thinking that they could really make this site work based on a couple of fellas in Chicago who were touting it.
Okay, thank you.
Ryan McClanahan, you're up. Ryan, how you doing this evening?
Good, doing good. Dan, this is absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for this. Joe Tinker, after he retired, he went down to Florida and became, like, I guess, a multimillionaire, selling real estate down there. Do you know of any direct connection that he may have to this at all?
I have not seen Tinker's name in conjunction with this development. I think, a few people ended up making money. I think Miller Huggins made some investments. I mean, if they got in early enough and just got out, they made money. There was a lot more ball players that lost money. Most of the ball players who got into Florida, there was a lot of, Huey Jennings invested in Florida real estate, nothing to this level, but specifically to Tinker, I have never seen his name associated with this.
And have you written a book about this at all?
That I am actually trying to do a book on a new biography of John McGraw, and this would be part of that. So we'll see if I can find a publisher and get it done in a reasonable time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
And if he gets that book going, we all know it's going to be great. Joe Ross, how you doing tonight?
Okay, thank you. Dan,
Go get him.
Fantastic. Great program. Loved it. Two quick questions for you, or two questions, whether they're quick or not, we'll see. First, what happened to that land today?
So the eastern half of it is the IMG Academy, which is the elite sports training facility that Nick Bollettieri started in about 1978 as a tennis program, and now they do basketball and, all sports. And the western half along the water is fully developed on the western half, but there's part of it that's still undeveloped, which gives you some sense of just how raw this must have been in 1925.
Yeah, the other question I have is how near is that to the group that was headed by Ted Williams? Ted Williams and the Tamposi family of Nashua built a big place out there that supposedly is very successful. And it's on the West Coast, but that's all I can tell you.
That's interesting. I'd love to look into it. That must have obviously been much later. And
Oh, yeah.
so I think, obviously all this land came back in value eventually. I don't think it, obviously, there's one book that attributes the Depression, at least partially, to the Florida land bust, called The Bubble in the Sun. And so I don't think any of the land came back till after World War II. But I think after World War II, obviously, it's gone up dramatically since then. So I can't speak to, I'd be curious where Williams' site is. I can't speak to exactly where it is.
Oh, okay. Finally, if you want to do a book, contact me. That's what I do. I'm a publisher and
All
an
right.
editor. So
Appreciate it.
Alex Stace, you're up. Alec, how you doing tonight?
Great, thanks, Dan. That was terrific. I guess I just realized that you're also a real estate guru, so you not only know a lot about baseball but real estate. So that was evident in your remarks. But I guess observation would be perhaps, given what's going on with Tampa, that this part of Florida is kind of cursed as far as baseball related real estate developments are concerned. But I guess more concretely with McGraw, I realize you talked a little bit about his personality, but don't you think maybe that he's so like success driven, and he was very like purposeful and like excellence oriented, and he assumed that other people maybe took things as seriously and as rigorously as he did, and he's used to winning, or at least being very competitive, and that was part of the fabric. But it'll come out in the book, as you indicated, so we look forward to that.
No, I appreciate it. I'm surprised that whenever sort of it felt like he wasn't there wasn't much happening. It's almost like everybody just felt like we're just going to sell lots and make money and commissions, and we'll figure this all out later. And McGraw understood that he couldn't, because when he was down there, he was working. But yeah, it's fascinating that how little was going on. And in retrospect, they're probably lucky they didn't spend much money on the infrastructure, because they would have lost whatever they spent on the infrastructure, as well as the rest of the money.
Well, his demographic for fans and his fame was, I think, in like northern Manhattan and whatever, and then maybe those people could not afford such a Florida plot. But as noted, it was part of a larger real estate boom and bust in Florida. But he was maybe at the crest of that wave. It combines a bunch of threads. I do think this one thing is so great could be its own book. But if you want to do a McGraw, you do whatever, I'm sure.
No, I appreciate that. It could, it could very well be a book. If you include the eastern part, you have 8,000 lots in total. And the total population of Bradenton and Sarasota counties at the time was about $35,000 to $40,000 by the 35 to 40,000 people by the 1930 census. If you took all 8,000 lots and you assume, I don't know what, 4 people per household or 3 people per household, you're almost doubling the whole population of the Sarasota Bradenton area. So the idea that you were going to have to sell these lots so fast, and you had so many of them relative to the population of the area, that, it just, in retrospect, it's hard to see how that was ever going to work.
All right, next up is Molly. Molly, go get him.
My apologies. First of all, I wanted to thank you for coming and presenting to us. But I was wondering, what attracted you to this line of research?
Well, I've always been interested in McGraw. If you look at any books that I've written where they've had a dead ball piece to them, there's always been a McGraw component. So I've been doing stuff around his various shenanigans for a long time. As Alex said, for my day job, I'm in real estate, and so this in particular did meet a great little nexus between my day job and my love of baseball. So once I sort of realized what was going on here, it was just something I couldn't resist. And plus, it's something that hasn't really been dealt with before. I mean, people have done research, and if you look at the various books, there's some commentary on it. But to actually go to the Bradenton County office and to start going through those records and just seeing how much money was really spent, and then to start going through the daily papers, it's really kind of fun. And then you find like that letter at the Hall of Fame from some real estate salesman sending a letter to Gary Herman telling him to buy 2 lots. I just find it all kind of amusing. So anyway, I don't mean to ramble on, but it is sort of a nexus between my day job and, my love of baseball from the era.
Well, thank you again, and I appreciate you coming to share your knowledge.
Thank you.
Alex Stace has a good comment in the chat. He says it's a good film idea. John Cusack can play McGraw. That's great.
Might be too
Francis
tall.
Kinlaw, how are you?
Pretty well. Doing the best I can, like
Go
all
get
of
'em.
us.
There you go.
I'd like to combine your comments, Dan, which were very, very interesting, with the post that Alec just made on chat a few minutes ago, and that is regarding the veteran players that McGraw had after this. I guess you could call it a fiasco. Was he bitter toward the veteran players, or was he just a man who was going to exercise his authority? On the other hand, had the veteran players done anything, either not selling land for him or buying land from him, that had upset him, or was it just a matter of his personality changing? Or I know he was a gruff guy anyway, but did it have more to do with anything the veteran players did, or more to do with the fact that he was just a bitter man?
Francis, good to see you. I should have been clear there. I apologize. No, it was just that he was a bitter man. The players didn't do anything wrong. This personality changed. I mean, the sort of the Imperial McGraw, you can't go around being the Imperial McGraw if people are laughing at you behind your back because you just had this massive business failure and cost your friends a bunch of money and are sort of getting sued all the time and having to, pay people back for the lots that they bought. And there was one story, there was a Virginia judge who he talked into buying a site, and the judge later said he drove out to a site. Essentially, he got a chauffeur and they went through these sort of like rutted tracks out to the middle, and he was in the middle of nowhere. And this was a guy that McGraw had personally talked into buying the lot. So you can just imagine how this relationship was after the fact. And it would have been this way with a lot of, the people, if people who could afford these lots were rich people. And all of a sudden, McGraw, they felt like McGraw had cheated them, or probably worse, they probably didn't think he cheated them, but that, they had been misled by McGraw.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you very much. And as I said, it was a great presentation, and it's great to see you again.
I can only imagine John McGraw trying to show his face in certain circles after all of this is said and done, and the embarrassment or anger or whatever emotion you want to subscribe to it, he might have felt overwhelming, to me at least. Let's go to Dixie. Dixie Tarango, how you doing tonight, Dix?
I'm doing fine.
Go get him.
And great presentation, per expected. My question is about the people in Bradenton now looking at you, looking to find this stuff. What was their reaction to this?
Well, the fellow at the Bradenton, or it's Manatee County. Bradenton's the county seat of Manatee County. At the Manatee County clerk's office, I contacted him, and he actually knew something about it. And he had sort of done some stuff over the years of looking at it, but hadn't really dug into it. So he had fun digging this stuff out with me. I actually went down there and spent 2 days in the office with him, and we were digging through stuff. And so, it was kind of fun for him, right? I mean, if you're sitting in a clerk's office, you're usually just I don't know what, but you're filing stuff and dealing with documents that come through. And so I'm hoping that he felt like I offered him an opportunity to do something. We've stayed in touch. He's a really great guy, and it's been great. I talked to the folks at the library, the Manatee County Library System, and the woman who ran that was really helpful too. Those maps that I had, she found those in some back room and went through all the work of trying to photocopy them. The map was probably, it was in pieces, but the map was probably like 4x4, and she sort of 4 feet by 4 feet, and she went through and tried to photocopy a bunch of it so I could get it and piece it back together. So the people that I talked to down there were great. I mean, they were really helpful, and they found the story really enjoyable. Some of them actually knew a little bit about it, and some of them didn't. But the fellow, again, he was just really fun to work with in the county records office.
Great.
Just another example of baseball bringing people together, right, Dan?
That's right.
There you go. Hey, Gary Mintz wants to ask you a question. Gary, how you feeling, brother?
I've been better, but my support to Dan, who's just an incredible guy and an incredible writer. So,
thanks, Gary.
Dan, how are you? I got two quick questions for you. So this is not a book. Is it a published SABR article or just your research?
It's just my research. I was going to publish it as a SABR article, but I'm hoping that within the next, couple of years, I'll be able to have it be part of the McGraw book. So it's not published anywhere at this point.
And my other question was, Charles Stoneham is the owner, and McGraw basically ran all of the baseball operations, but was Stoneham upset about you? You mentioned that for 11 weeks, basically, he'd be going down there and it would take, 5 days. So 11 weeks is a long time. Was he upset about his, personal business rather than his work with the Giants?
I would say so, but you're right. I mean, even during spring training, McGraw was pretty much not at spring training. Bresnahan was pretty much running spring training for McGraw in 1926 because, he still had hope in the spring of selling out the lots. I have not seen anything that where there was something publicly where Stoneham said he was unhappy with McGraw. My sense is that, Stoneham had just come out of his own problems in 24 and even into 25. There was these federal indictments on him. And so my sense is that he just didn't really worry about McGraw that way, but that's a good question. I haven't seen anything. And I think coming out of this, I think Stoneham clearly took more charge of the team. You can see that with the second, when the Giants traded away Hornsby after the 27 season, and McGraw claims that he was part of the decision, and so does Stoneham. But when you read between the lines, it's pretty clear that that was a Stoneham decision.
Again, Dan, thanks. Great job.
Thank you.
Top notch, Dan. Top notch. Anything else? Last licks. Anything else for Dan Levitt tonight? All right, as we mentioned at the start of our meeting tonight, we're going to get together 3 times this Saturday, February 1st for our big SABR Day meetings. The sign-up links are in the chapter meeting booklet distributed each Monday and also available at sabr.org/SABRDay. Make sure you choose our chapter's entry in the list. Members on the automatic sign-up list will receive their access links Friday. And finally, if you're a baseball fan watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to be alerted to each of our weekly uploads. And if you're not yet a member, you need to join the Society for American Baseball Research, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 80 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Dan Levitt, you are fantastic, man. Thank you very much. This is awesome.
Thank you for having me. You got a great audience. A lot of fun.
Man, I appreciate you so much. I know all of us out here do. We want to thank you very much for doing this tonight. We are going to see everybody on SABR Day on Saturday. Can't wait. Let's get everybody out of here. We'll see you then. Have a good night, everybody.